future of NATO. We have 5 defense ministers here to discuss that with you. And to lead you through the discussion, somebody who's supremely qualified to talk about the future of NATO, Jim Stavridis, former NATO Supreme Allied Commander and now Dean of the Fletcher School. Jim, that's over to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Good evening, everybody. I always say for these night owl sessions, the challenge isn't so much keeping you awake during the session. It's for you to decide to come to the session and not go to sleep in your hotel room. So I want to thank you for turning out such a great audience tonight. I don't recall a panel in the past that had 5 defense ministers. This is really quite extraordinary. And I do want to point out the geographic spread here. So if we think about our colleague, the Minister of Defense of Canada, who himself is from Vancouver, Canada, the very far west of this alliance, stretching all the way to the very far eastern edges of the alliance, where our colleague, the Minister of Defense from Turkey, comes from. Think about that geographic spread, really half of the earth covered by the defense ministers you see here this evening. So our program is very simple. I know you want to hear from them, not from me. So very quickly, I'm going to introduce each of them and then ask them, starting with the Secretary of State for Defense at the far end, to just speak for about 3 to 5 minutes and kind of, in the course of their remarks, answer the question that has been posed to us, which is, I think, a pretty simple one. Is NATO obsolete, or is it very important? I'm sure everybody here can know where that quote came from. Both of those quotes come from the same individual, the President of the United States. So that's a pretty interesting spread of opinion. I myself have spoken personally to President Trump, and he has told me how important NATO is. At other times, he's used the O word, obsolete. So let's unpackage that with this brilliant panel that we've put together. And let me introduce them, and then I'll start down at the far end and ask each to take 3 to 5 minutes and talk a bit about the alliance, where we're headed, and are we obsolete, or are we actually very important? So at my far right, I'm very honored to have the Secretary of State for Defense, Sir Michael Fallon. It's great to see you, sir. We have the Minister of Defense of France to his left, Minister Jean-Yves Le Drian. Bonsoir, Monsieur le Ministre. We also have the Minister of Defense, my very good friend, Jeanine Hennis-Plasschaert, with whom I served on a panel at Davos just a couple of weeks ago. My new friend, the Minister of Defense of Canada, a veteran who fought for the alliance, for Canada, in Afghanistan, Minister Harjit Singh Sajjan, welcome. And to my immediate right, the Minister of Turkey, Fikri, Işık. Wonderful to have all of you here. And Sir Michael, may I ask you to start us off?
Well, thank you, Chairman, and good evening. The one thing we have in common on this panel to my left is not that we're defense ministers, is that we all represent countries on my left that have borne the brunt of terror attacks in recent years. And you can't be at a conference in Germany, of course, without recalling that appalling attack on the Christmas market in Berlin. The alliance is here not just to confront violent extremism, but a range of threats to our collective security and our entire rules-based system. Threats that we cannot face alone. Today, the United Kingdom publishes its refreshed international defense engagement strategy, which seeks new ways of strengthening cooperation with our allies and allowing us collectively to pack a more powerful punch. At the heart of that engagement lies NATO, the world's most successful defensive alliance with a proven track record of helping to win the Cold War, assisting our US allies to counter the terror threat after 9/11. So in my view, the only right answer to the question is that NATO is very important in 2017. But to remain important, to remain relevant, to guard against obsolescence, NATO needs to become more agile, more responsive, needs to be able to act faster to counter terrorism, Russian aggression, hybrid warfare, and cyber attack. That means NATO needs to do three things. First, as the President has set out, fairer burden sharing. Numerous presidents have said that. All NATO nations need to step up to meet the 2% commitment. It is a pressing reality with the American taxpayer that Europeans should now meet their proper share of that burden. We're asking allies to reflect the 2% target in their national plans and to agree as they get towards the 2% to an annual increase in their defense spending to demonstrate their good faith with a target that all of us agreed in Wales. Second, we must streamline the governance structures of the alliance to make it fitter and faster. We need to give NATO's strategic commanders more flexibility and more autonomy. At the moment, they can only move a limited number of their staff in response to changing priorities. In a rapidly changing and uncertain world, we need to move at the speed of our adversaries. And may I also say, as a supporter and a good friend of NATO, we need to reduce the bureaucratic processes involved in it. Of course, NATO is based on consensus, and of course, all 28 have to find ways of demonstrating good value for money. But it shouldn't take a year to provide financial statements. Do we really need 5 separate financial control centers? Is it not time to break down the silos between the military and the civilian staffs of NATO? Third and finally, the alliance needs to be relevant today to project stability beyond its own borders. Today, you've heard how we're reassuring our Eastern European allies, deploying our enhanced forward presence in the Baltic skies, in Poland, policing Black Sea skies. We're also tackling migration in the Aegean. We're capacity building in Iraq and Afghanistan. We're operating a maritime group. We're sending in the UK a Type 45 destroyer in July. Yet it's all the more important that NATO demonstrates a 360-degree view, providing more total security, eastwards, southwards, westwards, as well as northwards. It is NATO that has the mandate, has the operational experience, has the tools to combat international terror in the Middle East and in North Africa. But to do that successfully for NATO means deepening our understanding of the global security environment. It means bolstering partnerships with our global allies, with the Counter-Daesh Coalition, with the European Union, and with each of the individual member nations. So my answer to this question is yes, unequivocally, NATO has never been more needed. But the key is unity. It is a united alliance that has earned the respect of foes as well as friends. It is by retaining the collective will and using it to modernize, to become faster, and fitter that NATO can stave off the criticism of obsolescence and can remain an organization that is for the good of the United States as it is for the good of Europe and the rest of the world. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary, and Monsieur le Ministre, vous avez la parole.
J'ai bien apprécié ce que vient de dire Michael Fallon.
Yes, I appreciated what Michael Fallon just said. To a large degree, I share your views. First of all, I would like to remind you that history is developing very fast. France only re-entered the NATO structures in 2009, that is, and 5 years ago, shortly before the Chicago summit, that was the beginning of the 5-year term of President Sarkozy. So expectations were high that France would be able to continue this commitment, and when President Hollande came into office, the question was, will he continue what Sarkozy decided, the structural plan? Well, NATO is a cornerstone of our relations. So when the decision had to be taken in France, our foreign minister of the time said, of course, we need to remain within the alliance. It's clear that was his conclusion. And that means for me solidarity of action, but also freedom of opinion. And ever since, we've never really asked the question in France. So if we ask the question whether we need NATO, the answer is yes, of course, because the threats have changed. The risks are becoming more numerous, more diverse, and the entire environment has become more volatile. So we need a firm basis. Yesterday, we talked about this at the meeting of NATO defense ministers in Brussels. Of course, this calls on us to deliver quite a lot. We need to implement our decisions. In other words, we have to react to the situation that arises. Currently, our alliance is strong because we have managed to fulfill our obligations as decided in Newport and Warsaw. You mentioned the 360-degree requirement. And enforced forward presence. There again, we are on the right track. Yesterday and the day before, we discussed it. This alliance is a nuclear alliance as well. In these uncertain times, it is important to point that out once again. And today, we should emphasize that once again. Third aspect. NATO should continue its path. They should remain reactive and capable of acting because of the new threats in the field of cyber defense. That is a future threat, but also when you think of terrorism. The alliance started only recently to deal with these problems because terrorism is a relatively recent threat, but it is another important task for us, and we need to comply with 3 criteria. First of all, our military function. We need to limit ourselves to the military function. We are an alliance of states, but we are a military alliance, mainly military. We should keep this in mind. Then, of course, we need to remain agile in our actions and in our reactions. We need to be more responsive, as Michael pointed out. That's part of our tasks that we have to deal with. Better responsiveness, also as regards our institutions. Then finally, we need to make a stronger financial contribution. That is what we committed to do in Newport, and we have to implement that now. Of course, we all have our constraints, but where there's a will, there's a way, as they say, and if all these conditions are met and we are on the right track, then of course NATO will occupy a central position.
I just spent 2 days in Brussels, NATO ministerial, so I'm afraid
I sensed that immediately, yes.
received some very much the same answers. But let me start by saying that strength at home, and this is what we have been discussing in Brussels, that strength at home and strength abroad is a package deal. So all of us share global interests, including the US. We need each other to be our best. And I think all of us also agree that globalization is here to stay. It will not walk away. So it is true that we undeniably live in a world that is more complex, more connected, also more contested. And I think all of us will also agree that the pace of events have increased dramatically, and that the international security situation is not very good at the moment, and there is little likelihood that it will improve anytime soon. Now, I am convinced, and that is what all of us agreed upon in Brussels, that Europeans and Americans will have to continue to work together in order to face up to all these security challenges, and in order to defend our values. So in my view, NATO is as important as ever. It is very important, not obsolete. And let us not forget that NATO is the backbone of our value system. In fact, it owes its very existence to the defense of our shared value system. Now, I'm convinced that if we would allow fragmentation within the transatlantic alliance, that we would pay a huge price. So we should not allow fragmentation to run its course. It is important that within the alliance, we continue to strengthen the rule-based global order, that we do not allow states to bend these rules into their own benefit, and that we resist the temptation to replace trusted alliances with spheres of influence that caused so much destruction and human suffering in the past. Now, obviously there is a relevant question, a US demand for more NATO burden sharing. And it's relevant and it needs an answer. It needs to be answered. And I would agree with it. The US demand for more NATO burden sharing is fair, totally fair. And not because President Trump is asking to act accordingly. It's important that he's asking it, but he's not the first one, really. I mean, President Obama did, Robert Gates did, many others did. But it's because it's also in our own interest. It's our security interests that are at stake. So European allies, as well as Canada, should act accordingly, should step up to the plate. At the same time, I would like to add that it's not about a simple calculation of who is paying what. It's also about the readiness of our forces. It's also about the willingness to participate in military operation, and with that, the willingness to take risks. And at the very end, I come back to my most important point. It's all about defending our values. So here I agree completely with the other speakers and with Michael Fallon's statements in particular. The key is our unity.
Thank you very much, Madam Minister. Well, let's cross the Atlantic for the moment and hear from the Minister of Defense of Canada. Sir.
No, thank you. And I also remind, coming from the West Coast, it's actually a 9-hour time difference as well. But one that I'm willing to do, because I really love coming out to Europe. And it's very difficult to carry on this conversation because, one, we just came from a ministerial meeting where colleagues have been working well together in many regards. We have great discussions on this. So I'm going to start it in a different perspective of the importance of NATO from a soldier's perspective. As you know, I have served, so I'm going to go through a little bit of my history. One is, where would Europe be if it wasn't for NATO and what they did in former Yugoslavia? I served on a mission with S4, and it demonstrates what NATO can do when it has a proper mandate, properly resourced, commanders given proper authorities to take action. And just by coincidence today, I received a picture, I don't know how it came out, it was actually on Twitter. Everything's on Twitter these days. Of a picture
Mostly our president.
That's an internal matter. Of a picture of me with a very black beard, 27 years old, young captain in Bosnia. And it was a picture of me in a northern, mountainous community helping a Serb community out that was displaced during the war. In the work that we were doing as soldiers, we felt that it mattered. We're seen tangible results on the ground. And I can only understand it from the lower perspective, and I personally got a real sense of satisfaction of what NATO was doing, bringing stability into the area, that as a young captain, that I felt something that I was contributing. I was proud to wear the Canadian flag, and I was very proud that I was there with NATO. And it was having an impact, and you can see the stability at this time, and look where things are now. Fast forward to Kosovo. What we're doing there. I never served there, but great work was being done there. Go to Afghanistan, and I did 3 deployments there. And so I was there in Kandahar in 2006 during the early days when we actually relieved U.S. troops who were actually moving to Iraq at that time. And then I was there in 2009, and then I actually was with the Americans with 10th Mountain Division in 2010, 2011 during the U.S. surge. And even for all the difficulty of that mission, we were having an impact. And I can give countless examples of why NATO was relevant. That our uniqueness of many different nations coming together with the interoperability, with a common goal, with a very difficult challenge in front of us, we were having an impact. I know this, if you look at Kandahar now, for all what you hear in the news, it is far better from what it was. I was frustrated in my first deployment. And then on my second one, people used to be frustrated. I used to say, you should have been here earlier. Then even on my third deployment. So there is success. And there is progress. But through difficult times, you come together, you work together, and that's what NATO is about. I saw that progress on the ground. So when I received the privilege of being the Minister of National Defense when I got into politics, one thing that was important to me was, I want to make sure I make decisions that are going to impact our troops on the ground. Because at the end of the day, it's our troops that actually do our work for us. And the commanders that have to design the military planning for it. And we put their lives at risk. And some of them, from our countries, our troops have paid the ultimate sacrifice. But the sacrifice was worth it. And it demonstrates to us, even through very difficult times, what we need to do. So with all that experience, where do we go now? We did learn lessons from those times. And one of the lessons that I learned when I came here was, can we as an alliance come together as political leadership, look at a problem, assess it, make decisions, pass it on to our military commanders to create the plan and get on with it? And the answer is yes. And I was impressed with that. So we may not like how fast it goes, and things do evolve, and we will, only internally in our own nations, but also collectively as well. So defense investment is important. So one of the reasons why the Prime Minister gave me a mandate to conduct a defense policy review, so we can do a proper assessment to determine what type of investments we need to make. And it's in my mandate letter. Multilateralism is very important with supporting NATO. But now that relevancy is also important, that we invest in the right capabilities and making sure we have the right tools to assess what's going on. Because at the end of the day, we need to make sure we have the right capability to have a better understanding of conflict, so that we don't just are reactionary to problems, that we can actually look at things and make decisions early on to prevent them from getting bigger. And that's what's really important. So our outputs also need to be very important, that reflect the type of investment that we're doing. And I'm confident that through what I have seen and the challenges that we've seen directly in combat, that NATO is going to be extremely relevant because of the leadership that all of us at the political level we've seen. We have great military commanders as well. And we will face the challenges together. And that's what the NATO is about: solidarity, interoperability, and demonstrating that we will be there together. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Minister. Well, let's move all the way to the east and hear from our Turkish colleague. Mr. Minister, please tell us how it looks from Ankara.
Benden önceki çok da
I would like to agree. I would like to state that I do agree with the views that were shared with my colleagues who took the floor before me. They put it in a very clear manner. The whole globe is now facing threats that had never been faced before. Especially democratic countries are facing with many threats at the same time. All of them are being challenging the democratic countries at the same time, simultaneously. There had been no such era where there are so many threats working on the same at the same moment. Right at the moment where we are standing as a globe, the two missions of NATO, deterrence and defense, as it had always been, is not enough. We have to be mainly working with the new threats. Now, at the moment, terrorism is globalized. For that reason, when terrorism became globalized, if we cannot fight against terrorism at the global scale, if we cannot unite our forces, then we would lose before terrorism. And in that sense, NATO is not an obsolete organization. Just the opposite. NATO is an organization where additional mandates should be added on the top of the traditional ones. As the Minister of Defense of a country like Turkey, I am coming from a region where nearly all the challenges we have mentioned are there. We are fighting against terrorism. We're fighting against hybrid war. We are fighting against proxy wars. We have to cope with cyber attacks. And at the same time, we need to stay agile in terms of our defense systems, and we need to continue our deterrence posture. So under those conditions, no, it is not possible for any single country to cope with all of these problems alone by himself. For that reason, countries uniting their forces is not a preference, it is an obligation. And from this perspective, NATO is the best model, is the best example from this perspective. So we can easily say that the need for NATO is not decreasing, just the opposite. Because of the new threats that are arising, the need for NATO is increasing more than ever.
Right at the moment, we're all experiencing a global migration wave. We're all facing with this. Fighting against illegal migration. It is a common problem for all of us. And in all of these areas, it is inevitable for the countries to unite their forces. When there is such a major necessity, it is our obligation to make NATO even stronger. Of course, it is for sure that NATO needs to be adopting itself to a new structure that would be meeting the new requirements of the age, while the system is being transformed from the Cold War needs into the new requirements of our age. And right at the moment, within NATO, we have had our discussions for the new command structure, for the new NATO structure. All our military personnel and representatives are intensively working on this. And it is for sure we can't put aside a fair burden sharing. It is important for everyone to meet their commitments. And as Turkey, we're trying to do our best as well. And at this point, there's one thing that I really need to underline, a very important point. Yes, NATO should not lose its deterrence posture and its defense capabilities. But NATO, whatever it exhibits on its eastern flank, should exhibit it in the southern direction as well, in the southeastern direction as well. We have taken the necessary decisions for the southern flank, but NATO had not met its commitments in the southeastern flank of NATO, where we are standing at this moment as Turkey. And we do hope that this will change in the short run, because NATO is even more required for the democratic world.
Quick points, and then I'm just going to open it up for audience participation, which is always the hallmark of a terrific event here at the Munich Security Conference. First, I just want to thank the panelists and point out kind of the extraordinary spread of what you just heard from the Secretary of State of Defense, who kind of reminds us of what these nations share, Minister Drian, who points out and reminds us nuclear alliance, incredible capability, the values-based proposition we hear from the Minister of the Netherlands, a foot soldier's perspective on the extraordinary missions NATO undertakes, and from our Turkish minister, a kind of a tour d'horizon of all of the different challenges that we face. So this, I think, fits together well, and I thank you for rehearsing it for 2 days in Brussels before coming here to actually perform in front of a live audience, so to speak. Second point I want to make is simply one other thing that all 5 of these nations share, and I recall from my time as SACEUR, all of these nations have lost troops in the mission in Afghanistan, some at very significant levels. On a per capita basis, some of the nations here have lost more troops per capita than the United States. So these are nations that have sacrificed blood as well as the treasure we ask of them. And then third and finally, I'm truly struck by the quality of the discussion tonight as we illustrate, I would argue, that the alliance remains anything but obsolete. So with that, I'd love to open it up to the audience, and to whom can I hand a microphone? Someone over here on the left, and how about the lady up here first, and then back here to this gentleman. Please identify yourself and where you're from.
Yes, I'm Merve. But NATO is in Afghanistan for 15 years, and can we say that it's a failure, it's a success? Because you know that the United States giving the biggest budget for the overseas contingent operations to Afghanistan. It's over $14 billion, and there is a coalition, but the resolute support mission. Can you recognize or regard it as a success? Do you think that the situation is better because the Taliban is spilling over the country and is getting more powerful? Even they are accusing the drone technology with the armed drone technology. They are saying that. So how do you comment on this issue, Afghanistan?
Who would like to make a comment on Afghanistan and where NATO stands on it? How about the minister from Canada?
I'm happy to take that question. We don't have troops in Afghanistan now, but I will give you my perspective on that because you have to define success, and it's very difficult to define it depending on how each individual looks at Afghanistan. And I'm going to give you a simple example, and then I'll give you a little bit higher example. In Kandahar, by 2011, there was soccer games happening in the stadium. The Nowruz Festival was the largest success, biggest Nowruz Festival since they had in a very long time. The cars lined up to going up to Cochrane district, where they celebrated. But before we were there were stoning of women, the atrocities that were being committed. So, from what I saw from early on in terms of success and the simple set of things, to me, that is absolute tremendous success. And the example I'll give you is, when I used to drive, sometimes in the armored vehicles, you're kind of half your body is out. 3 different occasions, and I used to have my face covered. And keep in mind, Kandahar is, as you know, a very conservative part of the country. Women who were forced to have men accompany them where they walk. 3 different occasions. I don't know who the lady were, because they obviously wear burqas, but giving us a thumbs up. I have no idea who the person was, what the situation was for them. But a simple thumbs up to a soldier, to who are going out to put their lives at risk, means a lot. So to me, that was success. But now when you look at the higher levels, when we were looking at development, it was very frustrating for me because we were always trying to create a westernized police force. And I was actually a police officer at that time on leave to serve as a reservist. And I realized our policing model is not going to work. I said that straight out. And it took us some time to adjust to that. But what we ended up doing finally was looking at what models do work. And where we had going into very difficult situations, where we didn't even have a police force, or one there was that was so corrupt, you actually, by the time we were leaving, you had uniformed police forces, good courses, brigades, Afghanistan troops actually conducting operations. When we were first there, it was difficult to even get an Afghan to actually fight alongside you. But there, afterwards, they were leading the charge. Yes, it's not perfect right now. There are other challenges of corruption. I'll call it warlord management as well, as part of the issue. But I can get into the details of Kandahar, but it'll take me a little longer of why that was a little bit more successful. But having said this, we have to define success in our own ways. And I can assure you, what we accomplished there at NATO was a tremendous success from what it was and what we went through. And there's a lot of lessons that we can learn from that to use for future conflict as well.
Yeah, and I would just add, if I could, at the peak we had 150,000 NATO troops there. Today we have around 15,000, so it's a 90% drop. General Nicholson has asked for, quote, a few thousand more, unquote. I think if the alliance continues to support this, I think this will go forward, and I really take the minister's point about needing a certain perspective on all of this. Secretary of State, something to add, sir?
Well, I think you've put your finger on it. I mean, we're asking now the government of Afghanistan and their military to deal with the same situation that we had 10 times as many troops to deal with. Let me just answer the question very directly. If it was right to go in, it has to be not right to leave before the job is done as well as we can do it. And in my view, we have to keep doing that job for 3 reasons. First, there are still transnational terrorist groups in Afghanistan that wish us harm at home here in our democracies. That's why we went in the first place. Those transnational terrorist groups are still there, and they still pose a threat. Second, if this country collapses, we here will feel the consequences very directly. It could be 3-4 million young Afghan men sent out by their villages to migrate westwards. And they're heading here. They're heading for Germany or Britain. And that could be the consequence of this entire country collapses. Thirdly, there are NATO values here. This is a democracy that we helped establish. 7 million people voted in elections for a new future for Afghanistan, voted to choose a government, however fragile it is at the moment. That government has asked for our help. And my view is we should stay with it until, as long as we can, until that job is done.
Thank you, sir. I think next question right over here.
Christoph Marschall from Berlin. I'm a little bit puzzled by the discussion not only this evening, but through the whole day. Everybody seems to agree to the 2% target, but only 5 of 28 nations are meeting it. Why there is this difference between talk and action? Are 28 nations acting irresponsible already for years, but not being willing to explain to us why they are doing this? In my country, there's now in Germany, a new proposal that we should have, instead of the 2%, a 3% target, and we should count together spending for the military, for development aid, humanitarian help, and so on. But even that would mean Germany has to spend much more money than we are doing at the moment. So why is here such a gap between talk and action? Can anybody explain to me?
Well, we have some wonderful political leaders here. Please, Minister from Netherlands, and then over to Monsieur Le Drian.
Well, the Dutch are facing a gap as well, to be very honest. I'm not proud of it, but it's reality. And I do think that for a long time, many Dutch, but many Europeans took the liberty, the security, the prosperity we have here more or less for granted. And it's, until the summer of war in the year 2014, with the annexation of Crimea, the downing of flight MH17, the ongoing destabilization of Ukraine. The Arab Spring started already in 2011, but Daesh confronted us in the year 2014. We had a wake-up call. Now, the United States said already many times it's high time for the European allies to step up to the plate. But again, we took our prosperity, liberty, security, etc., more or less for granted. But we had some severe wake-up calls. And we understand that freedom has a price, that security is not free, and that if we talk about collective security and crisis management and cooperative security, that it is a collective responsibility. It's a shared responsibility, and that we have to pay, we have to contribute in a proportionate way. So this is where it is coming from. It's a harsh reality, but we have to act. And we understand already for a while now, because that's why we agreed upon some new kind of arrangements in Wales. And we agreed upon a time schedule to go towards the 2% GDP rule in the year 2024. It will take some time, but we have to live up to our promises because it's in our interest.
La France.
I'm not going to answer this question because it is directed to somebody else, but I would like to contribute 2 more aspects. First of all, I'd like to remind you of the Newport commitment. The 2% rule was a Newport pledge, 2% of GDP, as far as military expenditure is concerned, and only military expenditure. So it's only part of the answer. But when it comes to the total budget, 2%, that is also to be used for capabilities, for equipment. We must not forget that. Now, as far as my country is concerned, as goes for the other countries as well, we had the time of the peace dividend, when defense spending was cut back all the time. But in the meantime, we have increased it again. We haven't reached 2% yet, but we will reach it in future. We're going to build up personnel, and we will reach 1.8%. But I'd like to mention something else as well. We need these budget funds, but we also need efforts when it comes to our commitment. Jeanine mentioned that. I think I have to repeat that. It's not enough to spend money. You have to show presence. You have to act as well. That's important.
Because it's such a good question. Isn't it time to get real? We adopted this target in 2014. We gave members of NATO 10 years to 2024 to reach this particular target. 19 of the 28 don't even spend 1.5%. 5 of those 19 don't even spend 1%. By no means the poorest 5 of the 28 NATO members. And we had, when Secretary Mattis quite properly put this on the table of the ministers yesterday, we had a range of explanations. Austerity. In Britain, we've been through austerity. We cut welfare spending in 2010. We're still cutting it, year by year. Yet we made the choice to decide to increase defense spending. To govern, I think it's a French phrase, to govern is to choose. We made the choice to increase defense spending, but to cut other spending. Secondly, we heard yesterday that it's not the quantity, the 2%, it's outputs. But if the output is good at 1%, then it would be even better at 2%. Now, of course, the pledge is to get there by 2024. What we are asking for now, and what Secretary Mattis asked for, and he referred to it today from this podium, was first of all some agreement on milestones, that those who haven't reached 2% should build the target into their public policy, into their defense plans, indeed into legislation. Second, we have proposed that those countries that aren't at 2% should at least agree, and I think defense ministers would welcome this when they negotiate with their finance ministers, they should at least agree there should be annual increases, matching above inflation every year in their defense budget, so we know they're climbing on track to meet the target.
Thank you. One tradition here at Munich is that we always have a question from one of our Munich young leaders, and I think we have Alexandra Bell, who's a fellow at the Truman National Security Project, who has a question for the panel. Please.
Thank you very much, and thank you all for being here so late in the evening. This question is for everybody. The New York Times has reported that in addition to developing and testing a missile that violates the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty, the Russian Federation has now reportedly deployed this missile. How should NATO respond to this continuing and seemingly expanding violation? Would NATO support or encourage the expansion of a more global ban on intermediate range missiles? And what is NATO's role in protecting and defending the international arms control and non-proliferation regime? Thank you.
Thanks, Alexandra. Well, that's a pretty both technical and broad question. I think the broad piece of it is the relationship with Russia, and the technical piece is a particular response. So the minister from France has his hand up.
Good man.
Je pense qu'il s'agit dans votre question de la remarque.
I think this question is really about stationing and testing cruise missiles which might be equipped with nuclear warheads. They are at variance with the Intermediate Missile Treaty, the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty. if I understood you correctly. So if this treaty is violated and we find out about it, of course we have to respond. Otherwise, we'd be back to the 80s. So it is very important for us to counter this risk as quickly as possible.
In particular. Okay, I think we have time for one more question. Gentleman over here. Right there. Yes, sir.
Thank you very much, Jim, for the way you are doing the job as a chair. This is great.
Thank you.
And I'm very glad that you mentioned that naming NATO O, and very important, has been made by the same person. What you didn't mention is that it had been the same person in the same interview in a German newspaper named Bild. I'm very glad also that you mentioned the core values we have in common, which are the base of the membership of NATO. It brings me to the same person. Not 60 minutes ago, he did it again. He twittered. And he twittered that CNN, NBC, ABC, New York Times are not only fake news, are not only his enemies, are enemies of the American people. Calling the free press enemies of the people, this is not about common values of democracies, this is about the language of Stalinism. And it brings me to my last comment. It's about a German journalist has been detained today in Turkey. I hope he's going to be released immediately. He's accused of being a terrorist. A lot of people in the room here knows him, and they know that he's definitely anything is a hippie, but he's not a terrorist. So the problem is, of course, we have a financial problem we have to deal with, and we have a problem of a lot of things and techniques and so on. But we have a huge problem of our common values and how to keep them together, and we have to fix it before we go for the next questions.
Thank you. I'll take that, I think, more as a comment than as a question, unless someone particularly wants to respond to it, which means we have time for one more question. Yes, ma'am. Microphone is sprinting your way. And please, again, identify yourself.
Thank you. I'm Rose Gottemuller. I'm the Deputy Secretary General of NATO.
Madam Ambassador, great to see you.
Thank you. The Ambassador of the Netherlands brought up a point she also brought up during the Defense Ministerial. I don't think I'm breaching any diplomatic secrets to say it's about the fact that NATO is now a bulwark for the international rule of law. And I just wondered if each of the other ministers, and perhaps you, Minister, as well, would like to comment on what that means to you, NATO as a current bulwark for the rule of law internationally. Thank you.
I think that's a good way to kind of round us up. So let me, as we began, let's conclude. So, Secretary of State for Defense, sir.
Well, thank you for that. And it's a reminder that at the recent defense ministers, Secretary Mattis spoke not just about modernizing NATO or about resources and spending, but also about NATO values. And NATO is an organization that has values, promotes values, stands by values, insists on values as a condition of membership, and is part of that international order, the rules-based system by which we all live and trade and work with each other. And I think it's extremely important that we do speak up for NATO values. This is not simply an organization about defense. It is an organization that defends values that we hold dear and that we hold in common. Values of democracy, freedom of expression was referred to earlier on, and the right to hold elections and to see governments lose power democratically as well as gain power. And we've seen threats to that. And if I might just, if you'll allow me, just to make a glancing reference to the last comment. You know, there's been an awful lot of fretting today and in recent weeks about Trump. In my view, there ought to be far more worry about Putin. It is Putin, not Trump, who's deploying these missiles. It is Putin, not Trump, who is indulging in aggressive behavior. It is Putin, not Trump, who is using misinformation and propaganda It is Putin, not Trump, who's interfering in other countries' democracies. NATO is part of our value system, and I would like us to, if we can, use the remaining part of this conference to ensure that we stick by with what binds us together and confront the real threat to our democracies.
Thank you, sir. Good. Madam Minister?
I just said, indeed, I just said, and I also did during the NATO ministerial, that NATO owes its very existence to the defense of our shared value system. And I think it's important to reflect on that and to communicate loudly about our shared value system. Also in relation to, for example, Putin, as mentioned by Michael Fallon. I also just said that we must continue to strengthen the rule-based global order and that we should not allow states to bend rules to their own benefit. Now, for example, in relation to Russia, I think it's important to kind of keep going a meaningful dialogue in relation to risk prevention and military transparency. But I also said to SecDef Mattis, for example, I really fail to understand how the remark of some good deals with Russia relate to the current positioning of Russia in, for example, the eastern part of Ukraine and the ongoing destabilization. So we have to be united, not only during a NATO ministerial, but also in our messaging. And everything goes back or relates to our shared value system at the end. This is a further explanation.
Other comments?
Yep. I just want to make a comment. At the end of the day, we also represent our respective democratic nations. We represent our citizens. The rule of law is what our citizens expect. We are elected officials based on that. And NATO is based on the fundamentals of our democracy from our respective nations. And it's so important that we hold true to this. That's what keeps our unity together. That's what allows us to send a very strong message to Putin on the international order or the disorder that he is trying to create. And it's our unity that's going to give us our strength to be very strong at the dialogue table as well.
Thank you.
Evet, NATO
It is a fact that NATO is a very strong organization that was established around the core democratic values, and NATO preserved its values up until now. When we are to correlate the daily political issues with NATO, we start to make mistakes. Turkey is a democratic rule of law. A single incident being associated to Turkey, I was not aware of that. I've just learned that with the participant who brought it up. Only the Republican prosecutors can decide for a detention. I don't know what had been the results, but probably if that participant had been an official in NATO, probably Turkey had been taken out of NATO.
One is, if you did a word map of this conversation, I think you would find the word obsolete came up maybe 4 times. The word values came up about 150 times. I think I at least need no better judgment than that to tell me that NATO remains very important. Please join me in a round of applause for an extraordinary panel.